Welcome back. Let's practice solving markup problems. All right, so here's our first example. We have a game store uses a markup rate of 40%. Find the selling price of a board game that costs the store $20. Okay, so for a markup problem like this right here, we want to use the following formula or equation. And if you want to know where this equation comes from, be sure to watch the lesson video for this topic first if you haven't already. But what it says is that the selling price S of a product is equal to its cost C plus the markup rate R times the cost C. Okay, so what we want to do in these markup problems is identify the values that we've been given and then solve for the one we don't know. And so looking at this problem, what do we know? What have we been given? Well, we are given the markup rate, right? It says the game store uses a markup rate of 40%. So what we're given here is that the markup rate R is equal to 40%, which as a decimal is 0.40. Just move the decimal for the percentage 2 places to the left, and you'll get the equivalent decimal. That's what we want to use in this equation. But then what else do we know? Well, we want to find the selling price of the board game. So that means we're going to be solving for S, but then we're told that the board game costs the store $20. So that would be the cost C. We are given that C is equal to 20. All right, and so let's substitute those values in for R and C in this equation, and then we can find the selling price S of this board game. All right, so we'll have S is equal to the cost, which is 20. So we have 20 plus the markup rate R, which is 0.40. So we'll write in 0.40, and that will be multiplied by the cost, which is 20. All right, so we're multiplying that by 20. And now the equation is already in the form such that the variable we don't know is isolated, right? The selling price S is what we want to solve for, but it's already by itself. So all we have to do here is simplify everything on this side of the equation. We just have to do some math here. All right, so let's do that. You want to start with the multiplication of 0.40 times 20. And you could put this into a calculator. That would be the quickest method. But since this isn't too complicated of a calculation, I will do it by hand. It can be helpful to rewrite a decimal as a fraction. And 0.4 is the same as 4/10. So what we would have here is that S is equal to 20 plus 4/10 times 20. Okay, and then 4 times 20 is 80. So we have S is equal to 20 plus 80 divided by 10. I just multiplied 20 into that numerator. And then 80 divided by 10 is 8. So S is equal to 20 plus 8, which is 28. All right, specifically $28, right? Because we are working with a selling price. So the units for that would be dollars. And so $28 is the final answer to this example. If the game store uses a markup rate of 40% and a board game costs them $20, then they would sell that board game for $28. All right. The difference between those two values, that $8 difference, that would be the markup for that board game, and that $8 would be 40% of the cost of the board game. Okay, so that's what's going on in this problem. Let's take a look at another. For this example, we have a set of golf clubs costing $480 is sold for $840. Find the markup rate on the set of golf clubs. All right, so once again, we are going to be using that same formula. We're going to be using it for all of these problems. It says that the selling price is equal to the cost of the product plus the markup rate times the cost. And so what are we given in this problem? Well, the set of golf clubs cost $480. So that would be the cost C. C is equal to 480. And then those golf clubs are sold for $840. So that would be the selling price. S would be equal to 840. Those are the values that we've been given. All right, and so the only thing we don't know here is the markup rate R, which is exactly what we were asked to find, right? It says find the markup rate on the set of golf clubs. So we have everything we need here to do that. We just want to substitute these values in for C and S in this equation, and then solve for R. So let's substitute 480 in for each of these C's and substitute 840 in for this S. Doing that, we will get that the selling price, $840, is equal to the cost of $480 plus the markup rate that we don't know but we want to solve for times the cost of $480. All right, and so now we have an equation with a variable that we want to solve for. So we need to isolate that variable term and then get that variable by itself. All right, so let's start by getting rid of this constant term. We can subtract 480 from both sides of the equation. So let's do that here. I'm going to subtract 480 from both sides. 840 minus 480 will give you 360. So we have 360 is equal to 0 because 480 minus 480 is 0. Those two values cancel out. But then you're left with r times 480, which we could just write as 480 times r. All right, the order of that multiplication does not matter, so you could write it like this. Now, to isolate r, or to solve for it, we need to divide both sides by that coefficient of 480. So let's do that. We'll divide both sides by 480. And so 480 divided by itself is just 1, leaving you with r. And r will be equal to 360 divided by 480. And both of those can be divided by 10. You can get rid of those zeros. So here's what we have so far. That markup rate r will be equal to 36 divided by 48. I just flipped the sides of the equation. You can do that. It still would be true. But then we can simplify further because both 36 and 48 have a common factor of 12. So we can reduce this fraction by a factor of 12. 36 divided by 12 is 3, and 48 divided by 12 is 4. So this is equal to 3/4, which would be the fraction form of the markup rate. But since it is a rate, we want to write it as a percentage. And if you're familiar with your decimals and percentages, you might be able to tell immediately that 3/4 is 75%. But if not, remember that you can multiply a fraction or a decimal by 100 to get the equivalent percentage. All right, so we can multiply that by 100, and then 100 divided by 4 is 25. So this would be equal to 3 times 25, which is 75. All right, so we get 75% as the value of the markup rate. Okay, and again, 3/4 is the same as 0.75 as a decimal, which also translates to 75%. Okay, so that's a pretty big markup rate. The set of golf clubs cost $480, but were sold for $840, and so the markup there is a markup of 75% of the original cost. Okay, and so that is it for this example. Hey there, real quick, before we take a look at the next example, if you find my tutorial videos here at JK Math to be helpful, then I'd like to invite you to join my membership site, JK Math Plus, where you get access to many perks, including bonus content and my exclusive community. The bonus content includes dark mode versions of my videos, extra example problems, and more, while the community is a private space online where you can post questions, have discussions, and study together with me and other members. To learn how to join and see a full list of everything you get access to as a member, you can head over to jkmathematics.com/plus. I'll have a link for that in the description of this video. So if you are interested in becoming a member, feel free to check that out. It's a great way to support me and the tutorials I make, as well as a great way for you to learn math better. But for now, let's take a look at the next example. Next up, we have a car dealer advertises a 5% markup over cost. If the dealer is selling a car for $27,300, what is the cost of the car? All right, so once again, we're using the same formula. So let's write that down first. We know that the selling price will be equal to the cost of the product, in this case a car, plus the markup rate R multiplied by the cost C. All right, and so let's identify what we know in this problem, right? What values have we been given? And the very first thing we're told is that the car dealer advertises a 5% markup. That's the markup rate. That is our value of R. R is equal to 5%. And if you move the decimal place over 2 places to the left, that is equivalent to a decimal of 0.05. All right, so that's the markup rate. And then we're also told that the dealer is selling a car for $27,300. So that would be the selling price S. S is equal to $27,300. All right, those are our given values in this problem. But now let's use them, because what we want to find here is the cost of the car. What did it originally cost before it was sold at this price? Well, we can find it because we know everything else in this equation. We know what the selling price is, and we know the markup rate. So we can substitute those values in for R and S in this equation, and then the only thing left to solve for would be C, the cost of the car. All right, that would be the only variable left in the equation. So let's do this. We'll have 27,300 as the selling price, and that will be equal to the cost that we don't know, plus the markup rate, which is 5% or 0.05 as a decimal, times the cost C. Again, we don't know what that is. But now what we want to do is solve for C in this equation, but before we can do that, we do need to do some simplification, because what we have here are two like terms, two terms with the same variable part of C. So what we can do is combine those two terms by adding their coefficients. This C has a coefficient of 1 because there's nothing there, so it has to be 1. And then this C has a coefficient of 0.05. So we'll have 1 plus 0.05, which will be 1.05. All right, so we get is 27,300 is equal to 1.05 times C. And now we have a very basic equation that we can solve. In order to solve for C, we just need to divide both sides of the equation by that coefficient of 1.05. That will isolate C and get it by itself, giving us the value of the cost of the car. So we'll divide both sides by 1.05. So these 1.05s will cancel out. And so flipping the two sides of the equation, so it's easier to read, we'll have C is equal to 27,300 divided by 1.05. Now, I don't recommend that you do this by hand unless you have to, but I'm not going to do that in this video because dividing by decimals is not the focus of this video. So I would just put this calculation into a calculator. And if you do that, you will find that the cost is equal to exactly 26,000. And the units there would be dollars. All right, the cost is $26,000 for that car. Okay, so if the car is sold for $27,300, and the markup is 5% over cost, then this would have to be the original cost. $26,000 plus 5% of that $26,000 would give you the selling price of $27,300. So that is the final answer to this problem. Let's take a look at one more example for this video. For our last example, we have a smartphone costing $520 is sold for $779. Find the markup rate and round to the nearest tenth of a percent. Okay, so once again, we're going to use the same formula that the selling price is equal to the cost plus the markup rate multiplied by the cost. All right, so let's identify what we know in this problem. We are told that the smartphone costs $520, so that would be the value of C. So let's write that down. C is equal to 520. And then we're also told that that same smartphone is sold for $779. So that would be S. S is equal to 779. And so those are our given values. That's all that we've been given. We don't know the markup rate. In fact, that's what we want to solve for. That's what we want to find in this problem. What is that markup rate R? And when we find it, it looks like we will have to round it to the nearest tenth of a percent. And we'll talk about how to do that when we get there. But to start, let's just set up this equation using the values that we've been given. So let's substitute 779 in for S and 520 in for each of these C's. If we do that, we'll have 779 is equal to 520 plus the markup rate R that we don't know times 520. All right, now what we want to do is solve for that variable R. That's the unknown value in this equation. So let's use our skills for solving equations here and isolate this variable term. The first thing that we can do is subtract 520, this constant value, from both sides of the equation. So let's do that first. We'll have minus 520. And so these two will cancel out to become 0. But then 779 minus 520 will be 259. So we get 259 is equal to that markup rate R times 520. And I'm just going to rewrite that such that 520 is the coefficient of that variable term. All right, so we have 520 times R. That's the same thing as R times 520. Now we can solve for that markup rate R by dividing both sides of the equation by that coefficient of 520. All right, so if we do that here, divide both sides by 520. These will cancel out, and you'll just have that r is equal to 259 divided by 520. All right, now that is not a calculation that we can do easily by hand. So just like with the previous example, I would recommend that you plug this into a calculator, 259 divided by 520. If you do that, what you'll get for r is the following decimal. You'll get 0.498076 and some more decimals. All right, there are more after that, but that's where I'm going to stop writing them. And here's where you want to pay attention, because the problem says to find the markup rate and round to the nearest tenth of a percent. All right, so before we do any rounding, let's rewrite this decimal as a percentage. You can do that pretty quickly by either multiplying by 100 or just simply moving the decimal place 2 places to the right. And the percentage would be 49.8076%. But now we want to round that to the nearest tenth. And the tens place is that first decimal place, so we want to round to that place. So we'll cut off all the other decimals. And the decimal after it is 0, so that doesn't round anything up. We are stuck with 49.8. Okay, so that's the final answer here. I'm going to write it up here. The markup rate R is equal to 49.8%. That is the markup rate rounded off to the nearest tenth of a percent. All right, so what that means is that for a smartphone costing $520 but is sold for $779, that the markup rate is 49.8%. If you take about 49.8% of the original cost and add that to the cost, you will get the selling price of $779. And so that is it for this example, and this was the last example for this video. But if you do want to get some more practice, I have another available on my membership site. So if that's something that interests you, feel free to look into becoming a member. You can find all the details on my website at jkmathematics.com/plus. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments. But if you don't have any questions, this is all I had for now. So I will see you next time.